Hi, everyone, and welcome to Should Alexa Diagnose Alzheimer's? We're just going to give it a moment for Zoom to load all attendees. Hello, everyone. My name is Carmel, Shachar, and I'm the Executive Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. I am very excited that we are hosting a session of the Health Policy and Bioethics Consortia, which is a monthly series designed to convene two international experts from different fields or give different perspectives on particular topics in biomedical innovation and healthcare delivery. The Petrie-Flom Center certainly cannot take sole credit or even the lion's share of credit here. This consortium series is organized by the Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics, as well as the Program on Regulation, Therapeutics, and Law, or PORTAL, at Brigham and Women's Hospital. I strongly encourage you to check out their websites if you come to this through the Petrie-Flom Center. If you're new to the Petrie-Flom Center, I strongly encourage you to check out some of our other events at our website or to sign up for our newsletter, which comes out twice a month. We try to avoid overcrowding your inbox, where you can get a sense of some of our other upcoming events. But in the meantime, the topic for today is, should Alexa diagnose Alzheimer's? There's been an increasing push to use technology that simply didn't really exist a decade ago, 2 decades ago, to give us more insight into our health. And these technologies are particularly interesting because they're in our homes, they're on our body, like Apple Watch, like Fitbit, and they can tell us some really personal information that can really change our perspectives on our lives, our health, or who we are. Before I hand it over to our speakers, some housekeeping. There will be a Q&A. We really want your questions. The speakers would love to engage with them. You can submit questions at any time using the Zoom Q&A feature found at the bottom of your meeting controls. That's the best way to send in questions. If you don't want to use that, or you just want to join the more general conversation, please use the hashtag #diagnosing@home. Again, that's hashtag #diagnosing@home. On the other hand, if you have any technical issues, which I hope you won't, please email us at petrie-flom@law.harvard.edu, and we will jump to your aid. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing the moderator for this event. He is our very own research fellow in digital home health at the Petrie-Flom Center, David Simon. David, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Carmel. And I have no brief introduction to do except to say that welcome to everybody. And I'm very pleased to be introducing our two distinguished panelists. We have Barbara Evans, Professor of Law, and Stephen C. O'Connell Chair at the Fredric G. Levin College of Law and a Professor of Engineering at the Herbert Wertheim College of Engineering at the University of Florida. And we also have Dr. Jason Karlawish, who's a Professor of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. And each of the panelists is going to speak for between 20 and 20 minutes. And then after each concludes their presentation, we'll open it up for questions, which I will moderate. So I'll let the panelists take it away.
Thank you, David. Greetings, everyone from Philadelphia. My name is Jason Karlawish. I'm joining you from actually the Perelman Center for Advanced Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, where the Penn Memory Center is based. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. I am a physician, a clinician trained in geriatric medicine. I also am a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania. I co-direct the Penn Memory Center, and I do research on topics at the intersections of ethics, policy, and the neurosciences. I'm particularly interested in ethical issues that arise as adult brains begin to suffer impairments. And being that I'm a physician, the disease model I've often worked in has been Alzheimer's disease. I'm at the Penn Memory Center where I see patients, and this is not done for just dramatic appeal. I happen to be seeing patients today. I rearranged my schedule a bit to be able to attend. Friday is my typical clinic day, so pardon the gloves and the hand sanitizer and whatnot. If you want to learn more about me and the work I do, you can visit my website, which is just simply my name, jasonkarlawish.com, and take a look where I've written on this topic and some other topics, and some of that work is up there. I'm in the Memory Center, where we diagnose and then, based on the diagnosis, care for older adults with cognitive impairment. And one of the more common causes of cognitive impairment certainly is the disease called Alzheimer's disease, which can cause either mild cognitive impairment or dementia. Let me just tell you a bit about what the usual routine is. In other words, what we've been doing for the last century or so. Patient comes in and they have what we would call a chief complaint. Memory is not that good and they want to work up. Well, they actually don't come in alone, partly by design and of our center. They come in with someone else, a spouse, an adult child, a child-in-law, friend sometimes. And that person provides a history, as does the patient. But we start with that other person, which is unusual in the practice of medicine. No offense, but we call that person the knowledgeable informant, with the presumption that this individual has witnessed the day-to-day life of the patient with sufficient vividness and detail that the history we'll get from them will inform us about whether the person, the patient, has cognitive impairment. And if they do, what the syndrome is and even the disease that may be causing that cognitive impairment. And in that conversation with the knowledgeable informant, the spouse, the daughter, daughter-in-law, we really are interested in what's a typical day. What does the person do on a daily basis? And we hone down on in the world of geriatrics what we call the instrumental activities of daily living: managing money, medications, using technology, using transportation. Because those are all examples of the cortex interacting with the world to allow a human to exercise his or her identity. And what we're looking for are problems performing instrumental activities of daily living: errors with medication, trouble using technology, the remote control on the TV, troubles traveling from point A to point B, whether that's by using the car or public transport. Because those are all signs to us that there may be higher cortical dysfunction, that there may be a brain that's having impairment. We also do talk to the patient about their perception of their daily life and their function, and we measure their cognition. But I present that to you, that standard of care, which was kind of what Alois Alzheimer's and his colleagues did in the early 20th century, albeit with different language and approaches certainly. It's really no different now in the 21st century at the Perelman Center for Advanced Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. But now, how would Alexa change that? And Alexa is just one example of technologies that begin to slip into the role of the knowledgeable informant. Because what Alexa is able to do is do what that spouse does, which is watch the person, monitor their daily function. The Alexa can begin to detect that this person isn't doing daily tasks as well as they used to. Now, I didn't bring slides so that you could focus on me, but I could show you a host of slides from work done by researchers such as the Architect Group at Oregon Health Sciences University that, for example, show that older adults whose computer use was monitored, in other words, how often they were on the computer as just a basic measure, that the hours spent on the computer, the decline in those hours neatly tracked the individuals who were developing mild cognitive impairment, the earliest signs of disabling cognitive impairments. In other words, less time on the computer correlated with greater likelihood of developing mild cognitive impairment. And in fact, we're able to show that that decline in time on the computer correlated with the presence of tau pathology in the medial temporal lobe. Don't worry about what that meant, except to say it correlated with a biomarker of the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. People who had less time on computer over time, when they died, had more tau in their brain compared to people who, when they died, were doing the same work on their computer. And the computer is just one example of our lives, our brains interacting with the world. And so there's Alexa monitoring what you do, what you order, what you talk, how you talk, your sentence structures, your conversational exchanges. And I would argue it's one example of many different technologies that passively take in all this data about your IADLs. And so there's certainly great promise that this can, if you will, diagnose Alzheimer's, certainly diagnose cognitive impairment. But how will Alexa decide that? So, because what's happening now is an upending, an inversion, or a reorientation of the clinical encounter. Instead of a human coming in and telling me about another human, there's a device producing data that has to obviously be normed to say that what's happening here is abnormal and needs to be attended to. So there are issues right away that are perhaps epistemologic issues more so than ethical or legal issues, although they do tie into legal issues that Barbara will explain later, around what thresholds will decide that what's being observed by these machines warrants someone doing something. So issues around norms and norming, which start to tie into issues of how do you decide that this device is actually working and should be sold and marketed for this purpose. But I'll develop that point a little more later. The device detects something. Who should the device now communicate this with? Again, my clinical encounter was driven by a concerned family member, a human worried about another human. Now I've got a machine alerting someone that a human is having problems. Who does that machine alert? Do they alert the person who's being monitored? And did the person want that alert? Did they purchase this machine with as many among their intentions, the desire that this machine shall alert me? Or is this coming out of nowhere? Or do they alert someone else? Am I installing Alexa in my parents' home in order for me to be warned that there's something wrong with my parents? And if that's the case now, how do I go about saying, I've been learning something about you that I need to talk about? Or might it alert me here at the memory center? Might we imagine someday where Epic, the lovely electronic medical record, alerts me that one of my patients is now having problems and needs to be looked after and checked in on? How will I initiate that encounter when the chief complaint comes not from a human, but from a machine? So that's the role of technology to detect cognitive impairment, and already some of the challenges. Norming, how do you decide? Was it purchased, gotten, put in for this purpose versus this is a side, if you will, purpose? And then the whole matters related to communicating. Who do I tell and how do I tell them that there's something wrong? All upends the usual course that humans to date have set up for how we decide that an aging human is having some problems with cognition. That's detection. What about monitoring? I realize the topic here is Alexa to diagnose Alzheimer's, but let me provoke you with ideas now around monitoring. In some sense, you say, well, is it monitoring to detect? But even after one has been, if you will, detected, technology now can monitor change. It can monitor the beginning of loss of independence. It can begin to say that this individual isn't doing as well as they used to on something that they were doing well on, and therefore interventions are needed. So mild cognitive impairment, having a little bit of trouble with the computer, et cetera, but otherwise fine. But now we're seeing some changes in driving, and this needs to be looked into. So you begin to see how these technologies become means to threaten someone's independence, someone's self-determination, their ability to live the way they want to live, because the technology is beginning to detect there's some problems. Now, mind you, before you think of sort of creating a sort of dystopian future, there's a tremendous roles here for technology, for detection and for monitoring. I mean, I have patients who hold up their smartphone and say, without this, I'd be lost, quite literally, because this smartphone gives me the directions to get to someplace. Or if I do wander, they don't say it that way, that someone can find out where I am. I have patients who have devices that alert the family member that they've exited certain areas, and so the family member can go and get them before they wander far and wide and into a perilous situation. And in that sense, actually have enhanced, if you will, the independence of the individual to walk around the yard and whatnot, and not worry that they'll leave the yard and go down the street and suffer harms. So there's great promise here, but of course, I think you're beginning to see the great perils, namely around now my life is watched over by other people. It's all very well for a loving, caring family member, perhaps, to do that. It's another thing, though, when it begins to be a massive corporation whose size and scope is named after a large rainforest in South America. Because, of course, that's data, and data to a company that's quite interested in now beginning to tell you things that you ought to buy and that you ought to know about. And you become a very valuable data point for marketing, for sales, for beginning to shape the world around you, for beginning to shape the world around you. Let's think about why we're worried about, why are there now 259 people on this? So in part, it's because, you know, Alzheimer's is a high octane diagnosis. It's a high octane stigmatizing label. And the idea of technologies monitored and looked over by who knows who, knowing things about our brain, is a threat to ourselves. It raises concerns of stigma, discrimination, through invasions of our privacy, suddenly receiving various messages of things that we might want to buy to help maintain our brain, et cetera. Others can have access to this, employers, et cetera, potentially based on how insurance or other matters are set up. I won't belabor the details, but I think you should begin to feel that as we surrender our private world to the Internet of Things, we surrender some of our autonomy. Why do we care about these diseases? We care about these diseases because fundamentally they're diseases of autonomy. They're diseases that begin to damage the mind early and relentlessly. I realize the stereotype of Alzheimer's is someone who can't bathe, dress, groom, feed, and toilet, et cetera. Yes, that can be the case late in the disease for some patients, no question. But early on, it's this relentless chipping away at your ability to exercise your autonomy, to decide where you want to have dinner, how to get there, what you want to order off the menu, pay the bill and put a little tip on it, and then get back home, all on your own. And it goes after all those things. And there's great promises that technology can do those things for us or help us do those things. But let's think about, again, what worries us. This isn't technologies that produce intelligence. This is technologies that produce or that use artificial intelligence. They're fundamentally are machines. And so let me sort of think about that. So what you've got is a machine that's attempting to help a damaged mind either be detected or repaired. And what is it about a mind that when we think about a mind, it has personal experiences of the world, phenomena, what's the color red, et cetera. And it has preferences, it exercises intentions. And certainly AI can begin to fill in for those things for a mind, particularly around intentions. The more the artificial intelligence becomes intelligent about who you are, the more it can begin to fill in for your mind as it's having trouble exercising your intentions. So let's engage in a bit of a thought experiment. I'll wrap up with this. So Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, developed Alzheimer's disease. He told America that in a letter to America that he hand wrote. He said, actually, I will be joining those who have Alzheimer's. So he actually distanced himself from his very diagnosis, but he had Alzheimer's. And so over time, he developed more and more disabling cognitive impairments, cared for by Nancy Reagan and Secret Service agents. And there's a story about Ronald Reagan, it's a true story, recounted by Robert Altman, the journalist, that he was in his home in Bel Air, and he had a visitor, and he turned to his nurse, and he said to the nurse, "Who's that man over there? He looks very important." And it turns out that that nurse, that man was George Shultz, his former Secretary of State, George Shultz. And I've wondered, what if instead of a nurse, a human, he had a robot? What if you had a robot who was programmed to know all about Ronald Reagan and Ronald Reagan's life, who he was, and who's visiting, facial recognition software, et cetera? What would the robot have said? And take it from there. How else would the robot have engaged Ronald Reagan in reminiscence therapy, deciding what he should be told and should not be told, et cetera? There's great promise for these technologies to detect. There's great promise for these technologies to provide support for the disabilities of cognitive impairment. There's great promise for these technologies to do things that humans don't need to do. But what concerns me for a disease that fundamentally is a disease of autonomy, a disease of the mind, of our ability to exercise our free will, is that fundamentally I think we need humans to help other humans be human, to exercise their free will. And so therein I think lies some of the fundamental moral conundrums of using technology to both diagnose, monitor, and intervene. Thanks so much. I've enjoyed the opportunity to give these remarks. I think now I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Barbara Evans, who joins me from sunny Florida. And then Barbara and I will have some Q&A.
Thank you. And I'll ask Laura if she could mobilize my slides. Thank you. The topic here, I wanted to emphasize, we're talking, of course, about voice-powered digital assistants generically and not singling out Alexa. It's very plausible that a digital assistant might be able to detect signs of cognitive impairment in its user, for example, based on changing speech patterns or asking the same question repeatedly. I have mixed feelings about this prospect of using a product like Alexa for diagnosis. Continuous, on the good side, there are some good things. Continuous in-home monitoring could be a really useful tool. I picture this sort of like getting one's blood pressure checked. If it's done at the doctor's office, quite often you're agitated because you waited in the waiting room and you're mad and your blood pressure's up. And you can get a much better indication with regular use of a home blood pressure cuff. Also, anyone who has ever cared for a loved one who suffers from a dementia or Alzheimer's condition knows how difficult it is to assess what is happening with your loved one. Casual observers can be fooled about the severity of the condition, and the patient is sometimes doing their very best to project an air that everything is okay. And sometimes the patient themselves lack insight and don't realize that there is a problem. So a digital assistant could help families pick up on signs that a new care arrangement may be needed. And that's all the more true because the adult children are usually medical lay people. So it's very hard to make decisions, and any objective data sounds helpful. And like Dr. Karlawish, I can also think of scenarios where this technology could enhance people's autonomy. We all have heard of a person who has an older relative that starts engaging in a really reckless spending pattern or falling for scams. And sometimes the family feels compelled to limit the patient's internet usage and access to a smartphone. And that can be so tragic if that smartphone was the person's one link to the outside world. And you can envision a technology that would assess the competency of the person using a device and maybe disable some spending and functions when it's not appropriate. And that would enable people to keep these technologies in their lives for a longer time. But then those are the good sides I could think of. There are some very concerning downsides. And I'll ask if Laura could advance my slide. Extremely important liberties are at stake. If a person is found to be incapacitated in guardianship proceedings, you can lose liberty, property, right to vote, right to make your own medical decisions. And that's a very frightening prospect. And states have adult protective statutes that in some cases require people to report when they see a vulnerable adult that may be encountering difficulty. And some of the states, it's not merely doctors that have to report. It can be a neighbor that spots someone who seems vulnerable and in danger. And a question that came into my mind was, would the digital assistance service provider be obligated to report you to adult protective services if it thought you weren't coping adequately? If that leads to guardianship, you lose a lot of rights, and all you get is due process as that happens. Next slide, please. We're all familiar with these concepts, and we know that there's a privilege against self-incrimination, but that only is for criminal proceedings, and guardianship is a civil proceeding. In a criminal setting, you don't have to testify against yourself, and the reason genetic information has been admissible is that it has been deemed not to be testimonial or expressive in content, so it doesn't fall under that privilege. Now, perhaps what we say to our digital assistant is testimonial and would be protected, but only in a criminal proceeding. And in a civil guardianship proceeding, or any civil proceeding, things a person says can be used as evidence of mental state. And a jury can draw negative inferences from one's silence or refusal to share testimonial evidence. What the due process amounts to is that the court would appoint a guardian ad litem that would make sure the proceeding was conducted fairly, but that person their role is not to implement your own wishes. Next slide, please. I also have extremely large concerns about data quality and reliability in the context of what's basically a consumer device being used to drive a diagnostic function. Next slide, please. We all remember this picture. The newspaper had used a survey technique, one of the early telephone surveys, and it turned out that at that time, people who had a phone in their home were sort of privileged people. So they were sampling technology forward privileged people. Pundits of the day said that Governor Dewey was the only man in the world who could strut while he was sitting in a chair. The rich love anybody who's that pompous, and they all said they had voted for him, and you had a biased sample leading to this. I worry about a diagnostic tool that might be learning what normal cognitive function is from a sample of people who use digital assistants. Next slide. I did a very fast search, and there is some market data on who uses these devices. As an over 65 person, I was pleased to see that there are some people in the sample of people using these who are reflective of me. However, that statistic was of all the 65-year-olds that use this technology, 41% were with that particular brand provider. It didn't say of all the people who use these, how many are over 65. I expect it's possibly a small sample. I'm also concerned how many poor people are in the sample of data collected from these devices. Perhaps one doesn't prioritize having a digital assistant if one is never home because one is working 3 jobs to try to feed the kids. So I would have real concerns about the representativeness of the sample, and also whether proper data hygiene is being followed to not use the same people for training data that you're using to validate the system and then to use it on them. So all of these concerns add up. Here's one last concern. Please, next slide. Last year, I was teaching in person, but running a natural language processing program in the background to create a transcript in case anyone missed the class due to quarantine. And I was astonished how many ways that software rendered the word FDA. This was my favorite one, the FDA regulatory scheme. And I apologize for showing this because once you hear that, it's almost impossible to stop thinking of it. A concern I have is that I know there are great advances in natural language processing, but it's still not completely reliable. And also, I believe there's at least a statistical correlation and perhaps a causal relationship between hearing impairment and cognitive impairment. If a person isn't hearing well, they may communicate in funny ways with a device that requires the use of hearing and speech. So I'm concerned how reliable the input data would be. Next slide, please. And of course, there are concerns about data privacy. I think most of us, or many of us, have come to a view that content should be the basis for deciding how much privacy protection there is, that the inference that Sally is pregnant should receive the same privacy protection, whether it came from a test Sally's doctor ordered or from a retail store's AI algorithm that's monitoring purchase data and drawing health inferences. In recent times, I've actually come to disagree with that view that that we should have a content-based privacy scheme. I'm very influenced by the work of Helen Nissenbaum, a privacy theorist, who has talked about the contextuality of privacy. We expect different levels of privacy in different settings. And this technology we're discussing raises questions about where we are. Should it receive the same protection we would expect in a clinical healthcare setting or in the broader surveillance society where stores and cameras and internet usage is being monitored, or in the home? We've always hoped not to be under surveillance inside our own home. I have ended up disagreeing with the view that we want uniform protection in all of these settings. Next slide, please. This is a busy chart. I took 3 different contexts. One is when clinical health data are generated and used in patient care, the traditional clinical health care setting. Then the second one is the use of health data in biomedical research. And the third one is what I call HIOX, health information outside the clinical context. This is AI algorithms looking at our purchase data and serving us ads or evaluating loan eligibility or law enforcement uses. Every context we enter has different ends and values that the context is serving. That's a point that that Helen Nissenbaum has made, and it is that is important in determining privacy policy because it informs the trade-offs we have to make between the virtue of keeping our data secret and under our control and the social benefits that might flow from using the data for other purposes and having it shared. I think we're most familiar with that middle row because many of us have studied research bioethics and think in terms of the common rule framework of de-identifying data or getting consent and only rarely granting a waiver of consent. That is specific to that context and may not be the right paradigm for privacy in the other contexts. The social benefit of data sharing varies a lot. In a clinical healthcare, that value is high and there's a large consensus it's high. The purpose of the encounter is to keep someone alive or protect their health. So it's vital interests that are at stake. So there's a higher value in sharing the data than in other settings. In research, you still have some of that value, but it's not quite as urgent because you're trying to help patients in the future who aren't here now. The social value of sharing HIOX, it really varies widely, and sometimes it's very dubious to serve ads that we didn't want to see in the first place. Oddly enough, when you balance in a utilitarian way, the case for consent norms that let us control our data may be the highest in that last scenario where the uses of our data may not be as socially valuable. Oddly enough, this is how our medical privacy law works. It's very utilitarian, and that surprises people because we hope medical privacy law for clinical healthcare looks like research ethics, and it doesn't. Next slide, please. This is an attempt I made to go through the HIPAA privacy rule, our major federal medical privacy regulation, which, by the way, was designed after an exhaustive study of data flows embodied in pre-existing state medical privacy law. So it wasn't a new idea to do it this way. They were following what they observed to be the tradition of how data flows in clinical healthcare. Up in that upper left corner, you see that HIPAA does let you release data with authorization, which is consent, or if it's de-identified, which starts to look like it's the common rule. But then in addition, there are in all 27 ways that it allows data to be shared, and all but the first 5 of them, which is the 22 at the lower left and on the right, do not require individual consent. And that always surprises people and think, oh, that seems very unethical. But what it is, these are high valued uses, for example, to regulate the healthcare system, to share data as needed to save the life of other patients, to report observations of child abuse or things that our society thinks physicians should report when they see it. And so in medical privacy, there's this very utilitarian norm of great data sharing. What this leads me to think is that we certainly don't want medical privacy norms to apply to HIOCs, health information generated outside clinical settings, because it would be too much data sharing, potentially for lower valued uses. So we need to look very, very carefully at privacy policy and treat this as a different context, even if the data are similar in nature to data that we see in clinical healthcare. The context is so different that we may want some additional guardrails. In medical privacy law, the reason this wide sharing of data has been considered acceptable over the years is that we aren't just relying on medical privacy law to protect people. There is a huge body of underlying health law that puts strong fiduciary duties of confidentiality on providers, healthcare institutions. Medical privacy law has sort of taken the view that consent is great, but if you really want to protect people's privacy, you put some enforceable threats and sanctions on the people who are handling the data, that it's ultimately more effective to protect people's privacy by fiduciary restrictions on what can be done with their data, rather than having them just consent to let their data be abused. Jack Balkin, the law scholar looking at AI and the internet or the surveillance society, has said we really do need to think about imposing some fiduciary duties on data handlers who are operating AI systems in context. Consent won't be enough to protect, because the imbalance of power between an individual person using a home health system and the technology providers is so great that consent probably can't be effective without some meaningful restrictions on what can and can't be done with the data. Last slide, please. I just wanted briefly to return to the question of FDA regulation. Software that renders a diagnosis is what I'm showing at the bottom here. That is something that FDA can regulate. It can't regulate all of it, but it can regulate some of it. But there are many other categories of AI-enabled systems that escape FDA regulation. For example, a wellness or healthy lifestyle device that's helping you monitor your heart rate for exercise. Because it isn't purported to be for medical use, it escapes FDA oversight. A major concern I have is that a lot of the consumer-grade electronics provide very good quality data that fairly closely resembles medical grade diagnostic equipment. It's not quite as good, but it's fairly good. And there's a risk that this non-medical grade devices and software can be repurposed and go into a clinical use. And we want to make sure that when that happens, it receives appropriate regulatory oversight for that use. I'll be happy to speak about these things more, but that was the extent of my prepared remarks. So I'll hand it back to David and Jason.
Thank you both so much for those enlightening and intriguing talks. I thought that I would start by asking both of you something that Barbara raised at the end of her talk and something that one of the attendees raised in a question. They sort of asked it in a pointed way, which was, after this talk, should we go change all of our privacy settings on Facebook and Amazon and so on? And the question I wanted to put to you was, to what extent, since this process is in some sense ongoing, these devices are being used to collect information about us, we don't necessarily know what that information is being used to do. How might we think about effective tools to keep our information either protected or somewhat private, or safeguard our privacy with these technologies operating as they do now? Are there any ways forward?
Well, I'll be happy to go first. I do not have any of these technologies. I don't have them in my home. I don't use the social media. I'm a privacy lawyer. I've read the privacy policy, so I didn't click through it. That has a huge cost, though. It means to get from point A to point B, I have a box of old antique paper maps, because if you don't share your location data, your car can't figure out where to take you. I think we need to realize that these technologies do offer a lot of advantages and people want them. But my assumption is that really, I suppose through very rigorous application of privacy settings, you can get some protection, but I assume anything I do is going to be mined for data and it will go into data systems. That doesn't really bother me, because except just theoretically, but I think it's part of the technology, and I don't know if it's necessarily escapable.
Yeah, I think you go online to I don't want to keep on going after one technology in particular, to a place where you can buy a lot of different things online, and you start searching for things that are about cognitive problems, and you buy some, you don't buy others. The next day on this, you're reading your favorite journal, New York Times, whatever, the Wall Street Journal, and the sidebar ads seem to be curiously tailored towards, things for people who have memory problems, et cetera. Even a company selling a diagnostic test or a pharmaceutical. I think, that already happens. I mean, I went online to buy shoes, and for weeks afterwards, I kept getting various ads for various kinds of shoes. I'm like, I know where this came from. I think it's one thing when it's about, sweaters, shoes, or shampoo. It's a different thing when it's about your brain. And I don't want to gin up a sense of, big brother's watching you rhetoric and whatnot. But I think, the valences are different when it's about threats to autonomy, et cetera. Having said that, as Barbara pointed out, we've created a Wild West for information when it's not about medical matters. You put it out there, you clicked on the thing, unless you block your cookies or erase them and all those other things, this is the way the world is. And they can go and find you and tell you things and shape the world around you and whatnot based on what your browsing history. We've allowed that as a culture. And
David,
so
I make one more comment there.
Please.
I think in this environment where we exist, we need to lose our fear of having our data be taken up into training data sets for AI. We had from the 1970s on this notion coming out of bioethics that we should be able to protect our privacy by not letting our data be taken. That was a fallacy all along. It doesn't protect your privacy to hoard your data necessarily. There's all sorts of other ways people can get it. But the thing it does in an AI-enabled world, if your data aren't in the training data, the results from those systems is not going to be representative of you. And in the case of medical AI, could even be dangerous and harmful to you. If I don't let my data be in that system, I'm sort of not voting for my health, because those systems, I may show up at healthcare and have them used to make decisions. And if people like me aren't in it, it's going to render bad decisions.
Yeah,
so there's a downside of privacy in this environment.
Yeah, I mean, the one area that I've been maddened about is the privacy, and I understand the privacy in banking and financial services. I mean, in those fields, you're told, like at brick and mortar banks, you're educated that your screen should never be near a window, so there's no chance someone could see what you're looking at on your screen. I mean, they take privacy seriously, and good thing. But God, I wish we could have a system where unusual transactions, errors in transactions, trigger alerts that come to me. Because the ground zero way to detect cognitive impairment is financial incapacity. It's not the only, but it's one. And boy, the stories are tragic when vast quantities of wealth are lost, et cetera, from scammers. So imagine a system where the banking and financial services industry can talk to the medical industry for that. But so to sort of build on Barbara's point, so that's a surrender of privacy. That's a flow of information that's like not to be expected. But boy, it would be great.
Jason, do you picking up on that? Do you worry? Let's think through your hypothetical where credit card companies are acting in concert to some extent with medical providers.
Yeah.
Do you worry that might create some information overload or put some additional stress on you as a physician having to react to numerous alerts? And what kind of system would be constructed to deal with that? I assume there'd be some kind of administrative system or some algorithm that the hospital
no, it's
has.
fascinating. I mean, has the EMR overloaded the practicing physician? Yes. So the idea of more alerts is completely unappealing and a kind of a non-starter probably. Having said that, within the banking and financial services industry, some of them have really embraced this, where there's a signal to noise detect. Any bank of any size and substance will tell you the customer's chronologic age over 75 are flagging alerts constantly. And any firm worth, that has, whether they approach it from risk management or client service delivery, are dealing with this. And some of them are proactive. I mean, they have a system set up for alerts that reached a certain level that go to staff to then go look into it, even to hold the transaction, et cetera. Others just risk mitigate it, deal with it as just, volunteer non-fit injuria. So within those industries, you see changes already where, they see the challenge for the financial service industry is to move from making this a risk mitigation issue to good customer service. Like, we're here to watch over your money. So if you start wiring money to Belarus, we're going to step in rather than just say, hey, it's your money, do what you want. Now, how that could then talk to me, you're right. I mean, that still needs to be figured out, but it can't just be more epic alerts because we've got too many epic alerts. And then there are issues of, you should have known, it was told, like, et cetera. So.
And then turning it back to Barbara, related to this point, suppose we have a system where Google Assistant and Amazon Alexa and a variety of other technologies are constantly monitoring us, and they're sending alerts to doctors or they're sending alerts to a patient's family. You touched on this briefly with respect to the reporting statutes, but are there ways we can think about constructing regime where those alerts have different legal valence depending on to whom they're sent or from where they're sent? Or is there some way we might think about structuring a society where these alerts are going to be more frequent and should be treated certain ways in different legal contexts?
I have real concerns about, and Jason brought this up. Am I going to consent? Who is a trusted person to whom my data can be given? And how do we weigh that consent in a situation where I may be descending to a point where I don't have decisional capacity? I think we need a process for thinking about that will build in some process protections for how those decisions are made. Clearly, sending an alert to me if I'm having cognitive impairment, I may not believe I have a problem. I may be trying to hide from my kids so they don't try to take over my life. That isn't effective, but to whom would we send these alerts? That's just a huge question. And I'm sorry, I don't have an easy answer to it. It's just really troubling issue.
And yet done right, it could work, you know, and you'd like it actually, you know, you know, you'd like to know that there's a system in place that, you know, if this thing starts picking up problems, it's going to let my trusted contact know, you know, we're seeing something wrong here. That would be an encouraging development in technology and human interface with the technology.
The problem is if I start out and have no impairment and use the system for 5 years, and then I may not have a neurologist or a geriatrician engaged at the time. So do we have some system that says when Alexa sends a certain alert, then we will refer you to some organization like the state bar for doctors that will decide who is an appropriate person to get my alert when I don't have anyone?
This gets back to my point, you know, in the end, it's about humans taking care of humans. So how could this device talk to another human who I trust, family, friend, etc.? And that's the system I think we need to set up. I mean, the irony of Alzheimer's disease is, you know, you want to diagnose it early in order to preserve your autonomy. But if you're going to do that, you're probably going to have to surrender some autonomy, or at least some privacy. It's a vicious irony, but I just don't see it as escapable, or dilemma, perhaps, maybe.
I don't see it as unsolvable. We have put way too much stress on autonomy and the Belmont principles that are sort of the 3 principles of bioethics: autonomy, beneficence, and justice. And many bioethicists have remarked that autonomy became the star in that trio. Beneficence was an older ethic there various authors have written about it. It was an ethic of responsibility that was binding on the healthcare provider, the recipient of data.
Yeah.
I feel strongly we're at a point, autonomy won't help us. It also doesn't really protect your privacy. The best way to protect privacy is statistical privacy protections, engineering privacy methods. We need to rethink the weight we're putting on autonomy. It cannot bear it.
I'm not going to challenge you, Barbara, but let me, if I could, I actually would just take a view of autonomy that recognizes, and maybe this is because I'm a geriatrician, that, you know, just like our minds are inherently bound up in our world, so too is our autonomy. And I mean, all of us to some degree or another, you know, are supported by others, you know, in order to kind of just think through life and get through life. And so, you know, I think there's a way forward that does start with an idea of autonomy, but it relies on a more interstitial concept, I guess, of it, rather than this kind of, you know, sort of almost like, you know, the political idea of, you know, where autonomy starts with ideas of battery, like, you know, don't touch me, you know, that's violated my space. I guess I approach it more the way our minds work, or that we are wrapped up in other people. So how can our devices better wrap us up with other people? So.
And I would agree with that. The kind of Lockean version of autonomy, of rugged individualism, is, I think that is good to critique that one. But there is an alternative view of relational autonomy, that we get our identity from our social relationships.
That's exactly, you have said back in what that is another way to say what I've said. That is, I hear you.
I think that needs to come to the foreground now, instead of the older view of I'll protect myself and I'll protect my privacy by controlling my data, because we can't control it, nor do we want to necessarily.
I think that is the political, ethical conversation that needs to be had.
So to shift a little bit till it's obviously still related, this is a question that's based on a question somebody asked. We've been imagining a world where some autonomous device, possibly powered by artificial intelligence, is monitoring your speech or your financial habits and maybe sending an alert. But suppose we had a slightly different system where, for whatever reason, the user or the patient consents, maybe in consultation with their physician, to use a technology that uses artificial intelligence to help the physician diagnose some problem. So assuming that the product in question is regulated as a medical device, might Amazon or some other company partner with such a device so that every morning when you wake up, or every week, the device walks you through a neuropsychological test or some shortened form of a neuropsychological test to get a baseline of how you're doing, and then generates a report, and that report is sent to the physician or to someone in the physician's office, and then the physician can act on that or not act on that. Does that help allay some of the privacy concerns, the ethical concerns that we've been talking about?
Barbara, privacy concerns allayed with that?
I'm not sure. I don't know why we're singling out people we suspect of cognitive impairments for that treatment. I noticed, and this was true at every age, that on a day-to-day basis, our intelligence is sort of like a sine wave going up and down. Usually, we're so tasked or overmatched for the world that we're in, that we're oscillating up here above the baseline you need to for your basic activities. But it would be good to kind of track that in healthy people, that we have no suspicion, and just warn them, you better not make any big decisions today. You're not doing as well as you usually do. I think we need, in thinking about this, if this is good enough for people we suspect of cognitive impairment, maybe we all should have it and have a little system that runs us through a check each day and advises.
Yeah, I mean, to build on Barbara's point, I mean, to play, historian of science, norms in cognitive testing didn't exist for older adults until the 80s or 90s. I mean, the end of the last century. It was not that long ago when you think about it, although norms for cognitive testing in general were a 20th century phenomena, let alone psychology. I mean, I think the holy grail in psychology is, never mind norms where you say, well, how many years of education are you, male, female, how old are you, what's your race, and we'll decide what the normal score is. The golden ticket is, what is the norm for this individual? And the way you gather that is you have to just do repeated constant assessment of the individual to get a sense of where they're at. There's a huge appeal for that. And I mean, I have many people come talking of their various apps that do just what you described with just this goal. I mean, it's a hot area of development, and it has a lot of promise for people to truly understand, to learn about what's normal for me versus abnormal, both for brain as well as body function. I mean, some of the questions in the chat have talked about Apple Watch and other monitoring devices. I mean, these data are already being gathered. I mean, I think right now Apple's pretty confident about what a normal gait speed is based on all the data they have of us walking around.
Yeah, as a kind of follow-up to something Barbara mentioned, taking this discussion a little bit beyond cognitive impairment and thinking about how these technologies might be used to help diagnose other diseases or conditions. So Jason, I wonder how you think about the problem of false positives and false negatives generated from some of this information, or the potential, what I like to think of as quasi false positives or quasi false negatives, information that suggests that someone may have a cognitive impairment, but isn't going to give you a diagnosis.
Yeah, well, it's baked into all tests, I mean, my question is going to be, is that risk of false positive and false negative different in the context of someone with Alzheimer's versus somebody with ocular degeneration? Mm-hmm.
Are there different risks presented in your kind of practice area that are greater or less than other practice areas for this kind of technology?
Well, I'll walk back from Alzheimer's. If the issue is detecting cognitive impairment because I monitored how you functioned in your daily life, there's going to be false positives in that, because, for example, the reason why my function changed was because of a physical problem, not a cognitive problem. And so the alarm, if you will, thought it was cognitive, but actually it's because I've got horrible plantar fasciitis. That's why my gait speed is slowed down dramatically or whatever it may be. So that's going to be baked in there. I don't see that as distinctly novel, although I may be missing some nuances or important distinctions compared to current technology. I do think one thing that these monitoring of our live technologies do present that's novel is they change the way we think about the way we measure diseases. You know, they change the epistemic stuff that goes into informing you've got a problem. From a regulatory perspective, it becomes very interesting, like, you know, what are the norms now that decide that you can sell this device for the detection of cognitive impairment because it's looking at your daily function in the world? I mean, those are big leaps compared to coming in and having a neuropsychologist assess you. I'm not saying that's a problem. It's just, it's a novel set of considerations that a regulator would want to think about, you know, because you're sort of you're shaping and reshaping the practice of medicine, if you will. There's not I don't think a fundamental problem there. It's solvable, but it's certainly a very provocative issue. I think Barbara gestured this. I'm sorry going off piste with your question, but you could right now, just like you can market something for memory, never speaking to a disease. I think the more concerning thing is not the well-meaning company that says, I want FDA device label, but the company that says, hey, this is just here to detect a memory problem, disease agnostic. And I would be concerned that that kind of stuff could fly out there without the kind of attention. I don't want to put FDA on the spot. It's been on the spot a lot in the last several months. But without the attention of a well-meaning public body to say, is this really working to detect memory? I think that's, to me, a very concerning thing. You know, just like you can now sell a nutraceutical or whatever it is for memory, and you completely escape any real public scrutiny, and you only have to watch the news between 5 and 7 p.m. Eastern time to see how popular that stuff is. You know, wait for the technologies that also will monitor your mother's memory. Boy, I hope they're really monitoring the memory and the signals I'm getting are worth it. And who's going to watch over to make sure those kind of technologies aren't just producing junk and sending out false alarms and whatnot? I think that's a real concern.
I agree with that. And we see that with consumer neurotechnologies, systems that gamers use to try to drive a game system with brain signals. They're not as good, but they're somewhat similar to medical grade devices. And there are a lot of creative people that can think of ways to repurpose that, sometimes without the product manufacturer's knowledge or involvement. And there's questions, is that signal that's being harvested and processed of a sufficient quality for that use? And very hard to detect. And I have real concerns, back to your question, David, that we, in returning genetic and genomic results, we've been very thoughtful of the potential of spurious results to cause psychosocial harms and unnecessary medical quests to explore a spurious finding. And this has that same potential. If Alexa or whatever other device I don't have in my house announces to me that it thinks I have some sort of cognitive impairment, I'm probably going to go try to follow up on that and find out what's going on. And that puts a huge cost on the healthcare system, and it alarms me. And perhaps we need some restrictions on what can and can't be done, and put more of it under regulatory oversight than we now have.
You know, I think, Barbara, your point about going back to consumer technologies for genetics is a nice parallel, because the whole appeal of those kind of consumer technologies, they often are going after things that people take very dear in private, you know, pregnancy tests, home HIV testing, you know, they're the kind of stuff that you could see a market out there like, yeah, I'll decide if I'm pregnant and when I'd like to learn, you know, about this very life-altering event, HIV infection. When things go direct to consumer, it's sort of getting at something that really matters a lot to individuals that they'd like to control the knowledge of and work it from there. And boy, if you had to pick a disease, a problem that people want to know about and want to have control over and whatnot, or I'll decide it's cognitive problems. I mean, because you're going after someone's self with cognitive problems. And you can see there's clearly probably a real appeal for a direct to consumer way to figure out what's wrong with me, because I want to know it's me and I'll decide what to do about it based on what I find out. So it could be a wild west with DTC type devices, given the valence of, my knowledge about me,
And another problem is some of the greatest concerns I have are these uses within families. Parents who are very concerned, is their child paying attention in class, or an adult child very concerned about the status of an elderly parent. And we give such a wide berth to decision-making that happens within families. And it's very hard for regulators to assert control over that. If mom is misusing this on her child or on her mother, who's going to know? How do we find out that's happening? And regulators would be very reluctant, I think, to bring an enforcement action against mom for doing something. I just see we have a system in place to manage this.
Yeah, related to this point about consumer grade technologies, this is something actually we're working on currently, this device versus wellness product line. But one of the questions in the chat box is about the consumer demand. This is related to both what you were saying, the consumer demand around retail products. Like, if all of these new products are being marketed to consumers and consumers think that they can help them understand their possibility of being diagnosed with Alzheimer's or some other condition, what kind of a burden is this going to place on the healthcare system? Not just people seeking care, but people asking their doctor to engage with the care that they've received through these apps, and what kind of obligations do physicians have, and how do we think about those sorts of issues?
Well, those are concerning. And also, I'm very aware of the potential for these technologies to further promote inequities in healthcare. These systems are not free. It doesn't seem to meet the criteria of reasonable and necessary for treatment that's going to get Medicare reimbursement going. And even if you had Medicare reimbursement, this stuff would be durable medical equipment, which is reimbursed in recent years through a competitive bidding process, which doesn't always lead to the best quality technology being the one that is covered. So are we going to have this system just to help people that have enough disposable income to purchase these technologies, and then everybody else just won't get it, assuming it's beneficial? I'm very concerned about that as well. Overburdening the health system, that's one concern, but then overburdening it with people who are already in a privileged position with regard to access to healthcare.
I mean, given the prevalence of humans who are aging, and as we add chronologic years, the likelihood of cognitive complaints, let alone cognitive impairment, one could imagine a large number of individuals, depending on the spread and depth of some device or technology or whatever it may be, therefore now being flagged or seeking out help. So the size and scope of what could be done could certainly be whelming for a healthcare system. I'm partly smiling the events of the last several months with the approval of a drug for Alzheimer's. The label initially for it was quite broad. Suddenly, millions of people could be eligible for a drug. I don't have a fundamental problem with that as long as the drug works. So, anything that involves aging, depending on the size and scope of it, can be rather overwhelming for a healthcare system.
I guess that sort of raises the question of, in my mind, how effective is the current regulatory regime? I know you just mentioned the new drug for Alzheimer's, which has questionable efficacy. Now, that drug, I believe, was priced out at something like $50,000 to $55,000 a year. Some of these applications are free. Of course, you pay with your data, but the costs are relatively low. And there's some benefits, right? The product might get developed, might be useful. The cost is low. And it doesn't seem like, at least in the case of drugs, the regulatory system is working perfectly. So do we want to move, I guess the question is, to a system where all of these kinds of applications or technologies are regulated more strictly as devices, as they're class 2 or class 3 devices? Or do we want to have even more rigorous review? And how well is that even working in the context of drugs?
Well, I'll tell you what I want, and I'll let Barbara weigh in therefore with what the reg would be. I mean, if someone's going to take their time to gather data about their cognition based on how they function in the world, courtesy of a device, I have no problem in principle with seeing that, getting that ahead of time before the visit to look at it. I just want to know that it's valid data, that there's more signal than noise there. And I'd be quite thrilled if it could reduce the time spent, gathering data. I mean, back to my opening remarks, I'm practicing a form of medicine that was practiced back when Alois Alzheimer's was doing his workups, namely sit down the husband and ask what's going on with your wife, Auguste Dieter, and then go interview Auguste Dieter. I'm saying I want to cut out the husband from that interview, but to the extent I could get data that says, yeah, you're right, there's changes in financial capacity, it's obvious. And this is a valid tool that's done this, just like, when I look at a complete blood count or a MRI, I'm confident in the validity of the data. I have no fundamental problem with that. So I'll now turn to Barbara and ask, given that what these devices are, that they're part of things that are already out there in the world, et cetera, is the regulatory structure adequate such that I could get good data, or is it a Wild West such that it's not? So Barbara, solve it for me.
There isn't a solution at this time. FDA has been
thanks.
struggling since 21st Century Cures was enacted in December 2016 to try to map out what sort of regulatory framework can even work for these products, which include software products. They recognized early on that a pre-market safety and effectiveness review just can't work here to prove that this device that's predicting I'm on the brink of Alzheimer's, to prove that it is correct, you're going to have to follow me for years. So the only way seems to be to allow things into use and try to gather data with which we can assess whether it works or not. And we simply do not have the data gathered yet that will drive the sort of regulatory controls we need. So one priority is to come to some sort of consensus on privacy that allows learning as we go, that tracks what was predicted and what was the outcome in a way that we'll learn what works and what doesn't. And that's a heavy lift on privacy policy.
I want to shift back to some ethical considerations. Maybe I'll start with Jason. So we've been talking about some of the technological risks, the technological shortcomings of some of these products. And I wonder if you could say a bit about the risk that physicians might become too reliant on information produced from these devices. You just said you sit down with a patient, you talk with the husband or the wife, and you get valuable information from them. And presumably that's information you may or may not get from data. But if you get data coming in that says something different from the husband, or the wife, how do you reconcile that? And just thinking about how some of these technologies develop in the realm of consumer products, we all have had experiences where whether it's with customer service or with our computer or whatever, where the computer says something, customer service says something that's just totally wrong, and it's obvious to you why it's wrong, but they have it in their system, and this is what the system says. And I could see something similar playing out in a physician's office. Well, I have the data that says that you did these transactions, And so how do you deal with that kind of conflict?
Yeah, well, I haven't dealt with it yet because I haven't got anyone hand me that technology. But the general question you're getting at is, it's very interesting. One I just dealt with it today actually is when people perceive a person very differently, and it becomes a negotiation about where the truth is. It begins. Many patients will tell me, I don't really know why not many, some do, some. I don't know why I'm here. I don't really see a problem. Whereas the family member does, and part of my job is literally to mediate and say, well, there's, can we find a sort of common ground of a problem here that needs my attention? Throw in a technology now with an individual. So here's a scenario that I think will be a challenge. I've been watching over you, David, and I'm beginning to see things in you that are concerning. And now I have to make you aware of you. And what are we going to do about you? Bear with the way I'm saying this, that will change clinical practice, because in some sense I'm bringing you your chief complaint. Your time on the computer has been dropping. And so can I do some memory testing or et cetera? It will change the clinical encounter if it's now an individual patient with data about them that I'm watching over and interpreting to then say back to them what's going on in your brain. And that will present a challenge in terms of how the clinical encounter unfolds. Yeah.
And what if the kind of information that you have in your possession is information about non-compliance with a particular protocol, or that the patient is lying to you? How can you ethically deal with that information without making the patient feel attacked or decide that they don't want to work with you anymore?
Well, so it reminds me of the classic case of what's called elder abuse or neglect. In this case, it would be neglect. I'm learning things about you that are concerning, and yet, you're not sharing my concern. I'm seeing money flying out of your account, that's totally out of character. Your savings are being depleted. No, I'm, winning a lottery, et cetera. I've had these, Barbara mentioned in her remarks, this turns to the adequacy of our adult protective services system, which is a state by state, frankly, county by county system in America. And it's pretty messy. It's pretty messy, and depending on the county you live in particular, and so this conversation recapitulates the importance of addressing the quality or lack of quality in some areas, unfortunately, of adult protective services resources that are out there, because that's who I would turn to absent family if someone's showing problems and yet not kind of working with me to come up with a plan to address those problems.
I want to use the last 7 or 8 minutes wisely. So I'm going to now re-engage with Barbara on a question that has come up in some of the comments that we have talked about briefly, which is overlaps with privacy, consent. My big question is consent or authorization dead? Do we even have a recognizable concept anymore to help govern legal relationships between parties? In this context, not in other contexts.
I understand. There are people who say it is. I think we do have some remaining ability to filter what we let out into the world, and I think we cherish it very much. One thing I always like to think back on, though, is that this notion that we should be able to control the sharing of our medical data really was a post-war attitude that arose in the post-war liberalism as the baby boomers came of age in the 70s. There were two federal advisory committees in the 70s that found that as of that time, it was quite common to take people's health data and use it in research and various public spirited uses without their consent. And the Privacy Protection Study Commission in a 77 report is the first reference I can find saying we ought to have people consent before we use their identifiable data in research. So this is not a long-standing historical norm. It's an aberration, this idea that we should consent to every use of our data that arose. It's a baby boomer bioethic theory, basically. And new generations may decide that they can come up with a better way to frame bioethics. I'm leaning toward putting less emphasis on consent and more on controlling the data handlers, putting some meaningful enforceable restrictions of what they can and can't do with people's data, whether or not the person consents to it. Just say you cannot make certain uses of data unless, and I think.
And what quality standards for an algorithm are to be able to have that algorithm make claims about a person.
Yeah.
Because right now it's just the wild west of algorithms. You know, everyone's got an algo to say you got this and you got that. And they're only as good as the data that go into them.
Yeah, and inclusivity and avoiding these biased data sets, that we have a current generation of clinical decision support software, and I'm talking medical grade software intended for use in clinical settings that performs better on white males treated at high resource academic medical centers than on other people. And why are we letting systems be in use that are not diverse in their training data? The answer is we don't have the data. Well, maybe we need to get it before we go forward with this technology and have a more inclusive training data standard.
Sort of goes back to my earlier question about how well is the existing regulation even working if medical grade devices are being used and in some cases are not accurate because of the patient population that they're being tested on. Suggests that there's a larger problem than just consumer grade devices, that in some sense consumer grade devices might actually get better data capture since almost anyone has a smartphone. And I've actually heard this argument from people in the industry. So I think it's important to think about how our existing federal regulations could be strengthened in that regard.
If I may, David, I'll just offer, I won't say a parting shot, but I did say in my opening remarks, in the end, these diseases, this problem of Alzheimer's comes back to humans and you take care of humans. And I will make one observation: for as big and vast as the problem of Alzheimer's is, it is interesting how the human infrastructure in place to diagnose and treat is so paltry. You know, I practiced in a healthcare system with an enormous cancer center and cardiovascular center, but a tiny little memory center. And at least we have a memory center here. And, you know, there's great promise that technology can improve our detection and our monitoring, but in the end, people want a human to help sort things out. And we have not set up a healthcare system to do that. That reflects failures over the last several decades. So, you know, in the end, I'm banking on the humans here.
Yeah.
I want to just ask, but I'm sorry to interrupt you, Barbara, but there's been a lot of caution. We've been talking about some of the problems with these technologies. And so I would ask, we only have a couple minutes left, we usually end a few minutes early, if each of you, maybe starting with Barbara, then moving to Jason, if you had your druthers, what are 2 or 3 things that you'd like to see happen moving forward with respect to some of the issues that we've been talking about?
I would like to see our country, and I think some efforts are underway at NIH and NSF to do this. We need to invest in getting good quality data to drive medical quality diagnosis and decision-making. Right now, we don't have a well-orchestrated data infrastructure, and it needs to be a large common infrastructure. And the other thing I'd like to see, I think we're making a mistake when we talk too much about FDA's role. They can't do everything. you also have to have the state regulators step up, the people that are regulating healthcare, regulating medicine, regulating home healthcare, and have a much more integrated regulatory approach than what we've seen yet.
I would love to see a world where there are some things to watch over me and the people I care about that validly pick up there's some changes going on here that need to be tended to. Managing money, managing medications, using transportation. I don't want to wait till people are disabled to finally step in and intervene. But I want that world of things, that Internet of the Things, attached to then a supported world of humans to do the things that only humans can do. And so that takes me to, what is the quality of our system of long-term care services and supports of humans doing what humans do? And, our country is just woefully behind on that. We had a shot in 1988 when we almost had an effort to pass a long-term care social insurance program. We still don't have that. So, the American families still have to figure it out on their own. So I'm bullish about technology for detection and monitoring. I'd love it integrated into the healthcare system, but I want that healthcare system to have the humans that can use it and use it well.
Very well said by both of you. I want to thank both Dr. Evans and Dr. Karlawish for a really engaging and fun session.
Yeah.
And thank all the people who attended and submitted questions.
Thank you, David.